Okey-doke, I think we will get started. Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Tomlinson. I'm on the PLEAWA committee and I teach politics and law at Korean Senior High School. I will be hosting this masterclass, and I'll also be running the chat. So if you have any questions throughout this for Ben, please drop them in the chat. I'll collate them, and at the end we'll do a bit of a Q&A session. Before we start, we should probably do an acknowledgement of country, acknowledge the fact that we are on Whadjuk Noongar land, and acknowledge the contributions to teaching of all students, but also the teaching of politics and law with their knowledge and wisdom. And we should acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to hand over to Ben Basell, who's going to conduct the masterclass. He's been teaching at All Saints College for 10 years, and before that, he worked for the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Western Australia. So he's a very experienced educator. He sits on the PLEAWA committee, he contributes to exams, revision seminars, and obviously masterclasses, one of which he's going to do today on how to write an essay and also how to teach it as well. So I will hand over to Ben, and if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat, and I will do my best to collate them at the end.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan, and hi everyone. And first of all, thanks very much to PLEAWA for asking me to do this. I know that there are plenty of experienced teachers out there who are very good at teaching essays, so it's a bit of an honour to be asked. And I will just start with the caveat that my presentation is a bit of a collaborative exercise, and I've drawn on the wisdom of some other teachers. So I'd like to thank those teachers as well, including Daniel. If you are a teacher of P&L, maybe you can give us a thumbs up or other indication in the chat, just so that we know that you're here, because part of this presentation is going to be aimed at you, and we'd like to just invite you to participate in the questions and answers at the end as well, and provide us with your wisdom as well. So with that being said, let's get started. I'm just going to share my screen here. And hopefully everyone can see that. Dan, has that come through? Okay. I'm just making sure that I can get through my slides here. Bear with me. My slides don't seem to be able to advance. Dan, do you have any tips on that?
Ben, if you use your direction keys, are they able to move?
No, that doesn't seem to be working.
Close the presentation for me, please.
Yeah, hang on.
Try and share your screen again, but instead of using the presenter button, use the one that's just to the left.
Just to the left, which is the...
Yep, that one there.
That one there, all right. Let's just try that again. There we go. Aha. Righty, I might just get rid of that. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to divide this presentation into two sections. The first part is going to be aimed at students about how to write essays. And we're going to go through how to deconstruct questions, how to plan essays, and then how to construct essays. And then I'm going to leave a little bit at the end of the presentation where I'm going to talk to teachers about some tips for teaching essay writing. Hopefully neither side will be too bored while I talk to the other side. Hopefully there's something in there for everyone. So let's start with students. So a lot of students out there are going to be thinking, how the hell do I write an essay? And I think the first place we need to start as politics and law students is with the rubric. Hopefully everyone has seen this rubric. This is the essay marking rubric that is used for WACE exams, but it really should be used throughout year 11 and 12 for marking essays. So let's break the rubric down. We've got 25 marks in total, and we start with 5 marks for explaining relevant terms and outlining the parameters of discussion. So You get 5 marks for explaining all relevant terms and outlining the parameters of discussion. So you want to start by, well, at some point, you want to define the key terms from the question. Okay. And then you want to tell us where your essay is heading. In other words, have a thesis. Your thesis is your basically 1-sentence answer to the question. What do you think the answer to the question is? So making sure that is somewhere nice and prominent up front in your essay. Then we move on to the next section. You've got 10 marks, so the bulk of the marks for discussion of relevant issues, including pertinent examples. So this is marks for your content. How well do you know your content? Have you got a logical sequence of ideas? Do you have plenty of political and legal studies knowledge? Have you got lots of examples? So if you're not including the words, for example, at least once in every paragraph, then you need to start including those words to get up there towards those 10 marks. Then we move on to 7 marks for evaluation, assessment, and analysis. So here's where you need to show that you are aware of counter arguments. So you're using the word however, or on the other hand, and showing that you understand both sides of an argument, and that you can land somewhere after assessing both sides of an argument. You know, where do you land in this discussion? And then finally, 3 marks for your conclusion. So you want to make sure that you're linking back to your thesis in your conclusion and your arguments that you've made throughout the essay. And just a word on the thesis before we move on. I like to think of the thesis as a golden thread that runs through your essay. So it's mentioned in the introduction, and then you touch on it in each paragraph, and then you come back to it in the conclusion. So that there's really no doubt in the marker's mind that that is your argument throughout the essay, and that's consistent throughout the essay. Okay, let's move on. So the first thing you want to do is think about deconstructing the question. So I've got here a question from the 2021 waste paper. This was in last year's waste paper. The question was, the House of Representatives in the Commonwealth Parliament has several functions, but these have been compromised in recent years. Evaluate this claim with reference to 3 distinct functions of the House of Representatives. So what I want to encourage you to get into the habit of doing is to not rush in reading the question. Spend 30 seconds to a minute thinking about what the question is asking you to do and what it is not asking you to do. Have a highlighter in your hand once reading time is over, and highlight key words and phrases. So you can see here I've highlighted House of Representatives, Commonwealth Parliament, compromised. That's a key word that we might need to think about. Recent years. We know that recent is a bit of a code word in politics and law for the last 10 years. So that's something we need to take notice of. And then evaluate this claim with reference to 3 distinct functions. So, for example, if we were to stop and pause and think about what this question is asking us to do, we would notice that it's not asking us about the Senate. And this is important because quite often, well, one of the syllabus dot points is the roles and functions of the Commonwealth Parliament. And we tend to consider the House of Representatives and the Senate together. But in this question, it's only asking us about the House of Representatives. So we don't want to start going off on a tangent about the Senate when we could be focusing our attention on the House of Representatives and getting maximum marks. So once we've deconstructed the question, we want to get into the habit of planning. And I really can't emphasize this enough. You want to start getting into the habit of thinking about what each paragraph will be about when you see a question. This should start to become an automatic habit. So you see a question and you think, okay, what's paragraph 1 going to be about? what's paragraph 2 going to be about? What's paragraph 3 going to be about? And then if you write quickly enough, what's paragraph 4 or 5 going to be about? So here's an example. And I use this sort of template with my classes quite a lot. And I understand that some other teachers do this as well, where you have 4 columns, and the left-hand column you devote to definitions, and then 3 other columns for 3 body paragraphs. So you can see here, I've picked up that the main things I want to define from this question are Commonwealth Parliament, the House of Representatives, and then I want to say what 3 functions of Parliament I'm going to talk about. So we know that some of those functions are representation, legislation, forming government, and holding government responsible. We might like to talk about what compromised means, and then tell us that we're talking about the last 10 years when we see the words recent years. And then you can see here, I've just sketched a very quick dot point sketch of what I want each paragraph to be about. Now, this question it lends itself fairly well to splitting up into paragraphs, because it's asked us to talk about 3 distinct functions, and we can say, well, let's put a function in each paragraph. So paragraph 1, I want to be about the function of representation. So I'm going to talk about what the theories of representation are. So we're going to talk about delegate, trustee, and partisan representation. Let's talk about some concrete examples. So some opportunities for delegate representation, for example, private members' bills. And then there's that important however word. We'll talk about strong party discipline and executive dominance and how they might have compromised that function. And then an example there, the recent religious discrimination bill. Then paragraph 2, let's talk about legislation. So we'll make the point that the government legislation can pass the House easily because of their dominance of the numbers. And we can use an example there. Then we can have a however statement. Executive dominance, again, comes into play. We know that the government has control of the standing orders, which means reduced scrutiny and not many private members' bills make their way through. And we can have rare minority governments where we get successful private members' bills, for example, Medivac. And then paragraph 3, I want to be about holding the government responsible. Let's talk about the theory first. So for example, question time and committees and individual ministerial responsibility, those are all mechanisms aimed at holding the government accountable. However, Dorothy Dixes are not very effective at holding the government accountable. We get the government dominating committees in the lower house. Individual ministerial responsibility has been dying a slow death over the last 10 years. And we've got plenty of examples to draw from there of ministers not resigning or resigning and then coming back from the dead and joining the cabinet again. So that's just walking you through one plan. I encourage you to get into the habit of doing that with any essay question you come across. You can see there that there's some themes there. I've talked about the theory, then the practice, and that's a big theme that comes through a lot in politics and law. We talk about the theory and then how things work in practice. And you can see that however word there in every paragraph. So that will encourage you to consider the other side of the argument. So I'll stop at this stage and just say feel free to jump in on the chat at any stage. I know Dan is monitoring the chat, so Dan, feel free to jump in if there's any urgent questions. Okay, so once we're done with the planning, then unfortunately, we've got to start writing. And my tip to you here is just to write as much as you can. But if you're not sure where to start, scaffold it for yourself. And by scaffolding it, I know the teachers will know that word, but for students, it means give yourself some assistance to start with. So get a past paper and get the answer guide from that past paper And if you're not sure where to find answer guides from past waste papers, your teachers should be able to help you find those online. And have the answer guide next to you and write a practice essay open book with the answer guide. Okay. Then you can start to give yourself some assistance, and then you can gradually take away that assistance. So for example, here's the answer guide from this essay question from last year's waste paper. Have this next to you and use it to help give you some structure and some tips for what your paragraphs are about. There's no shame in that. In fact, it's very, very helpful. All the musicians and sports people out there will know that we don't get great just from the start, that we've got to copy the greats before we become great ourselves and before we can become good writers or musicians or sports people ourselves. So use as much help as you can when you start. So I'm going to get you to read some things here, and I'm going to get you to think about what these different paragraphs are including. So I've got on your screen, hopefully everyone can see, a sample introduction to this essay question. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read this introduction, and I want you, if you can, highlight on your computer or just with your mind, see if you can identify there the definitions in this introduction and the thesis in this introduction. So I'll just give you a minute or so to do that. Okay, how did everyone go? I hope you were able to identify those two elements. I'm going to go forward a slide, and hopefully you identified, if I can, go forward a slide. My PowerPoint seems to have stopped. Bear with me.
You just exit and re-enter the presentation mode if you want, Ben.
Okay. Doesn't seem to be working. Sorry, bear with me. My apologies, everyone. Let's try that again. Okay, so hopefully you've highlighted something like that. You can see there that my definitions, I start with some definitions. The Commonwealth Parliament is Australia's national representative and legislative body consisting of two directly elected chambers. And then we want to make sure we define the House of Reps, because that's what the question is focused on. The House of Representatives is the lower house of those two chambers, consisting of 151 members, representing 151 electorates across the country. Right, and then I've got a little bit of what the theory of those functions are. And then my thesis. This essay will argue that a number of these functions have been compromised in recent years, brackets, last 10 years, defining that, in that executive dominance, strong party discipline, and a decline in the convention of ministerial responsibility have led to these functions being performed to a less than optimal extent. So I'm including a definition of compromise there at the end of that thesis. Any questions about that coming through on the chat, Dan?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Have quite a few things, actually. Well, let's start with the first one. So Divya asked, isn't it recommended that you have your thesis in the first sentence? What do you reckon about that?
I would say, look, I would say there's no law against that, but I am more used to having it towards the end of the introduction. It's certainly a strong start. Dan, what would you say about that?
In the chat, I said, I think it's, I guess, a matter of style. So some writers will put a thesis at the start to really emphasize it to the marker, or as you would say, beat them with their thesis.
Yes, yeah.
Others might start with definitions just because you're getting them out of the way and sort of defining the scope of the essay. So I think as long as you have all the components, like definitions, a thesis statement,
right.
You know, I think that it's still an effective introduction.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
We do have a few other questions. Are phrases like "this essay will argue" or classically "in this essay I will," like, are these phrases okay?
Look, I've used "this essay will argue" here. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's a good way of signposting to yourself and to the marker about what your thesis is. My personal preference is to avoid first-person phrases like I. That's just a style thing, preference for me. Do you have any views on that, Dan?
I would agree. I would steer clear of using I, my, we, but I think this essay will argue is fine. In fact, you're like clearly signposting to the marker, you know, where you are doing, or like you're indicating what you are going to put in your essay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, you continue.
No, I'm all good.
Yeah. You know, if you're good at using passive voice as well, then that can be a good thing. So you could say, it will be argued that. It's a little bit more convoluted, but it kind of takes the first person out of it, which we want to try and do in academic writing, I think.
Yes. The other thing that someone wanted me to address is, wouldn't more definitions in an introduction be required to achieve a higher intro mark? Now, I don't know if you would agree with this, Ben. That first part of the marking guide, nothing there actually says introduction, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So it's, even though a lot of people may treat it as like, you know, this is what you should do in your introduction, you can also define key terms in your body paragraphs. And
agreed.
That still gets you those marks.
Agreed, yeah. So you don't have to treat your introduction as your definitions dump. In this essay, for example, we're going to be talking about those three functions in the three body paragraphs, right? So in the first body paragraph, I would be defining the representative function at the beginning of that paragraph, and that would count towards those 5 marks for definitions. So there's nothing stopping you from having definitions later in the essay as well.
Okay, that is all the questions for now, but I'll let you know if there any more come in.
Okay, great. All right, so let's move on to a body paragraph. Now, don't be scared. I know this is a lot of text. Let's do the same thing, and I'm just going to give you a few minutes to read that and see if you can identify those 4 elements that I've highlighted up the top. So definitions, examples, counter arguments, and then a link back to the thesis. So I'll give you a few minutes for that. Okay, how did everyone go? So hopefully you've been able to highlight those different elements. Here is, well, again, it seems that when I pause for a while, it doesn't work. So yeah, just going to go out again and go back in. Oh, that didn't work either. My apologies, everyone. Sorry, Dan, I'm having some technical issues here. Let's try that again. Okay. Okay, so this paragraph is fairly heavy on the definitions up front. You can see there that I've defined things like, well, I've had to talk about why it is that responsibility is one of the functions of the House of Representatives. I'm defining question time, I'm defining individual ministerial responsibility. And then I get into some counter arguments about how those functions have been compromised in recent years with Dorothy Dix's and individual ministerial responsibility not really working. I've got some examples there of Bridget McKenzie and Barnaby Joyce, and then I link back to my thesis there at the end there. So any questions coming through on the chat about body paragraphs?
Yes. Rhiannon, I will leave your question about conclusions for the moment, and I'll bring it up later, just when we get to the conclusion. We've got what kind of structure is commonly or preferred to be used in a body paragraph, and I think you've got your example up on the screen there. Is that right?
Yeah. So the structure that's commonly taught is to have a topic sentence. So in this instance, my topic sentence is the first sentence. It tells us that this paragraph is about the House of Representatives being where government is formed. Okay, and then you're going to have a bit more explanation here. So I'm needing to explain that I've got you know, a Westminster system where the majority party is the one that forms government, and therefore as part of the parliament holds them responsible. So I'm needing to just connect those dots a bit before I get into examples. So you've got your topic sentence, you've got your explanation, and then you've got your examples, right? And then you've got your linking sentence at the end back to your argument. So that's the TEAL structure, T-E-E-L, that's commonly taught. Once you start getting into year 11 and 12, you can start getting a bit more complex about that. And then P&L essays themselves, you can start to fiddle with that a little bit, where you might have a few more definitions at the beginning. You need to have your however statement, your counter arguments, and your examples.
We've got a few questions about counter arguments. I'll just try and organize these as best I can. Would counter arguments be better embedded in each paragraph, or can they be addressed in their own paragraph?
I think that's a horses for courses thing. I always tell my students that there are many different ways to skin the paragraph cat, meaning that mostly it comes down to readability. So if you find that you are getting to, if you're writing a paragraph and it's getting on a bit in length and you haven't yet addressed a counter argument, that's okay. finish off that paragraph, and then start a new paragraph with the counter argument. So here, I think it would be feasible to start a new paragraph with the word however. And then you can kind of consider that those two paragraphs form part of a meta paragraph, if you will.
We've got, I guess, a question about the whole purpose of a counter argument. If you make a counter, doesn't that go against your whole argument in your, your introduction, your thesis? What's the point of making one?
I think it's to show the markers that you understand all sides of an issue. It doesn't mean that you need to undermine your argument. And of course, it depends what your thesis is in the first place. Your thesis might hedge your bets. So your thesis might say, while the functions of Parliament have been adequately performed for the most part, they have been undermined to a certain extent. And then you give yourself room to explore both those sides of the argument.
Okay, I think we've covered counter arguments, but we've got questions about other aspects of the paragraph.
Okay.
A couple of people are suggesting that they're worried that their evidence is a bit brief. Often if they discuss evidence to the extent that's done there, they don't seem to receive the marks because they don't include like the dates of evidence or, that's those specific pieces of information. So with your examples and your evidence, how deep would you go?
Well, let's bear in mind that it's not a PhD thesis and you've only got about 50 minutes to write this. So we need to be practical about it. I would, with your evidence and examples, I would make sure that the marker knows that you know what you're talking about, but without compromising the flow and argument of your essay. So for example, in this paragraph, I would not go into the torrid details of Barnaby Joyce's affair with Vicky Campion, which is what he originally was had to leave the ministry for. That's unnecessary, right? All the marker really needs to know here is the relevant details for this topic, which is that Barnaby Joyce left the ministry for a personal misconduct issue, but then he was allowed back in, right? Bridget McKenzie left the ministry because of a conflict of interest. You don't need to go into all the details about sports rorts here because that's not really the main issue here. And then she joined the ministry again. So I think it depends what the main game is, what the main topic is. Here, we don't really need to know all those details about what Bridget McKenzie and Barnaby Joyce have done. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I guess people were just like a little bit concerned that like if they were writing this paragraph, would they need to link the blue bit, like the example, to the thesis a little bit more and like analyze it further? So even though you're not mentioning like why Bridget McKenzie or their issues, their personal propriety, just maybe going into a bit more depth in the evidence section.
Yeah, look, you're not going to get punished for going into a bit more depth here, I think, but at the same time you've got to have your eye on efficiency and the clock. So it's a bit of a trade-off. I know that sometimes I've read essays from students where they're so taken with the story of something and all the details because they've learned all the details of this story, they can't help but include it in their paragraph, but it kind of takes them on a bit of a tangent and it takes them a while before they get back to the point that they want to be making. So you want to try and avoid that as well. Would you agree, Dan?
I think so. And I think something that does maybe distinguish the higher level essays is that they can include a lot of detail in their evidence. Like, for example, like fully citing the name of legislation, fully citing the name of cases, But I think Ben is right in that when you are citing evidence, you should really only include details that are relevant to the point that you are making. So sure, you could definitely analyze that like a little further.
Mhm.
But I guess what we're looking at is, I suppose, paragraph structure. Someone's just asked a question, how long should we write our body paragraphs for ideally? I think that is something that you've addressed before when you said it really comes down to how long is your paragraph already?
Yes, yes. That's a difficult question. How long is a piece of string? Look, it depends how small your writing is or big your writing is. It depends how fast you write. Yeah, it's difficult to answer that. I think as long as you try and stick to a good paragraph structure with these elements, then you're on your way to greatness.
Yeah, and if you feel like your paragraph is getting too long, divide it in two. I don't
Yes.
think, as long as your paragraphs are well structured, I
Mhm.
don't necessarily think that is going to be held against you.
Absolutely.
I'll have one other question, then we can continue on. It was from Anish, which is, to what extent should the topic sentence link back to the core thesis rather than be a definition? Is this just a matter of style, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I don't think I've done that here. I think as long as somewhere in the paragraph that you are linking back to your thesis and reminding the reader what you are arguing, I think that's okay. Speaking personally, I haven't tended to use the topic sentence for that function. I'm not sure about other teachers out there. I don't think there's a concrete rule against that.
No, I don't think there's no hard and fast, like markers are not looking for a very rigid paragraph structure that everybody has to replicate.
No.
They are looking for some key elements,
Mhm.
one of which is you need to make sure that you are consistently linking back to your thesis, and that if you mention a counter argument, you are linking that back to your thesis, so you're not just contradicting yourself.
Yeah.
So as long as you've incorporated that into your paragraph and it is very clear to the marker, I think that you are free to start your paragraph with definitions as to like clearly outline to the reader what you are going to discuss.
Absolutely. And if I could just have a look at this paragraph and perhaps link it back to the marking key, I think the red sentence at the end there, the linking back to your thesis, that's going to help you come up in the 7 evaluation marks, as is the dark green portion there. So that's going to help you with those 7 evaluation marks. And then everything else is going to help you with those 10 marks for issues and examples. Okay, moving on to conclusions. So here's my sample conclusion. Again, I'll give you a little bit of time to read and see if you can identify those 3 elements there. Okay, I'll move on for fear of freezing my PowerPoint again. But in my view, in my humble view, recognizing that there are other views and approaches out there, a good conclusion should re-emphasize your thesis. So that's what I've got in red at the front there. It's a variation and theme of my thesis from the introduction. So while the House of Representatives still performs the functions of representation, legislating and holding the government responsible to an extent, these functions have been compromised in recent years. Try not to rewrite your thesis word for word. You've only to give the reader a bit of variety. And then you want to try and summarize the arguments that you've used throughout your essay. So that's what I've tried to do here. Australian democracy is largely intact, with universal suffrage and compulsory voting ensuring one vote, one value in the House, legislation being debated and scrutinised for the benefit of the country, and governments needing to answer to the House for their actions. So you can see there, in one sentence, I've tried to cover off on responsibility, legislation, and accountability, which is what my 3 body paragraphs would have argued. And then drawing your evidence together and having some sort of final observation. This is perhaps the hardest sentence of the essay, I reckon. So I've tried to sum that up and say something like, however, the issues of executive dominance, strong party discipline, and the gradual erosion of individual ministerial responsibility have meant, sorry, typo there, have meant that these 3 functions are not being performed as they were intended at Federation. So that's my conclusion. There's 3 marks up for grabs for a conclusion. So if you can do something along those lines, you've got a good chance at those 3 marks. Any questions about conclusions, Dan?
Yes, we've got a couple. And obviously, if you have questions, chuck them in the chat, because there are quite a few. Before we get to the questions, I will note that we are technically coming up on the finishing time for the, the Zoom call. So I'll just note that if you have to leave for whatever reason, I'm recording this and it will be made available to you afterwards, whenever the recording has finished converting. But for now,
Yes.
We had a question from Rhiannon Fennell, who asked, is it okay to, in the conclusion, to, I guess, put your personal opinion in the conclusion?
Okay, again, as we said earlier, I would try and avoid using the first person, so try and avoid I or my. I think it's fine to tell us where you've landed in terms of your evaluation of the issue without personalizing it. Of course, we also want to try and avoid emotive language in academic writing. So I know students sometimes get quite passionate about things and want to say things like terrible or, you know, egregious violation of human rights or whatever it is they're writing about, but we want to try and keep it academic language.
Okay. We have Miles has suggested that in your conclusion summary, probably towards the end, it's best to include a statement of significance, or like if there's any suggested reforms that could be mentioned, you could include this in your conclusion. What do you think, Ben? Is that a good idea?
I think that's a great idea. Yep, that can be included in towards the end there. If you've got some ideas about how things could be improved, in particular, you might, in this essay, you might want to suggest that Dorothy Dix's, we get rid of those. And I know that's actually been proposed in Parliament in the last year or so. So if you're aware of that, then by all means talk about that.
Absolutely. I guess, and we've got a couple others. What about restating a case study in the conclusion? Now, from memory, the marking key for conclusion says linking to evidence. Is that right?
Drawing the evidence together. Yes. Yeah. Look, you don't want to go into too much detail in the conclusion. You wouldn't want to be raking over the coals of the Bridget McKenzie case study in sordid detail again. But if it's been a key part of your argument, then mention it as part of your summary, sure.
And yeah, I guess at the end of the day, like the conclusion, as much as you don't want it to reuse, you know, the same words, like you are literally repeating yourself, you are recapping points that you've already made. Like it is a summary. That's what a conclusion is.
Sure, absolutely.
Can you please re-explain what the last sentence of the conclusion should include? Does it always end with a however, which is the counter argument I think you said? I guess this like ties into something we've already, like throughout an essay, there are lots of different ways that you can write an essay and write it effectively. So how you structure your conclusion is up to you, so long as you have certain components, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've started my sentence with a however here, but that's not, that won't apply to every situation. It won't apply to every person, right? What I've tried to do with my last sentence here is draw together the evidence that I presented throughout the essay. You know, I would have talked quite a lot about executive dominance. I would have talked about strong party discipline, although it says strong party disciple there. And the erosion of ministerial responsibility. So I've tried to mention those things again in my conclusion, just to remind the reader and the marker what my argument is about.
Okie doke. We have another question, I guess, about counter arguments. When you look at a counter argument in a body paragraph, could this be considered an extension of your thesis where you're commenting on the functions of, in this case, functions of the House of Representatives in theory and in practice, and how they have been compromised?
Sure, yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with that.
I would think that, like, if you mention a counter argument as to provide discussion, you know, if you look at the SCASA glossary of terms, discussion means you mention points for and against a particular idea.
Yes.
If you mention a counter argument and you don't link it to your thesis, you've just contradicted yourself. So it is really essential that if you note a counter argument, I guess like what Kate has said in the chat, you do need to then like link it into your thesis and make it an extension of your thesis rather than just arguing against yourself. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, agreed. Okay.
Does every paragraph need a counter argument? Or can a counter argument be its own paragraph? I think we've already answered that. Piper, you can include them in, you can include both in a paragraph, or if it's a really complex idea you're talking about and it's getting really long, you can separate them into two separate paragraphs. It is totally up to you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
Shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for all the questions, everyone. So some tips for students. Listen, just write as much as you can. Write as many paragraphs and essays as possible. Provide scaffolding for yourself. So find past waste papers and their marking guides, or if you know about Creelman's, or if you have a copy of Creelman's, or if your teacher has a copy of Creelman's, get that. That has some really detailed answer guides in there, and have that open to the answer guide and write an essay, a practice essay, open book, because that will provide you with some assistance. The other thing to do is to get a PLEAWA good answer guide, which we've got a link to there, and I think Dan might have a link to in the chat as well. And have a look at the sample essays in there. Have a go at marking those essays with the marking key so that you get more engaged with what the marking key is requiring. And if you can put that teacher hat on or that marker hat on, then that will help you with your essays as well. And then eventually wean yourself off the scaffolding and write closed book and timed. So set yourself a timer for 50 minutes, 55 minutes, and see if you can write an essay closed book. Finally, use your teacher. I don't know of any teachers who wouldn't be ecstatic to be receiving practice essays from their students. I know they're all encouraging you to do that. So send them practice paragraphs, send them practice essays, bug them, email them at odd times of the day and night. Not too late, right? You've got to get your sleep. But write, and get feedback from your teachers, because that's what they're there for. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. Well, we're already over time. We're going to try and get through this. This is a little segment aimed at teachers. So, teaching essay writing. One thing that I would recommend is to start early. And I may be preaching to the converted here. One thing that we've been doing at my school is doing some heavily scaffolded essay writing in years 8, 9, and 10 to try and build that skill early and to to make it a long-term investment for the upper years of school. So this is just a screenshot of part of a booklet that we've been using with, I think this is from a year 10 thing, where we're getting students to write an essay comparing Australia's democracy to another country. So you can see there, we've got it pretty heavily scaffolded. We get them to write out a few topic sentences, pick the best one, then explaining how to elaborate a little further, and then give some evidence, and then analysing how that makes Australia democratic. And then we provide some space for getting some peer feedback as well. And then that carries on with the other body paragraphs and the introduction and conclusion as well, with some similar scaffolding. So we're finding that's paying quite a few dividends in the upper years as kids get more and more used to how to structure paragraphs and how to structure essays. So that's one thing that you could explore if not doing so already. Here's another example of a scaffolded essay plan that I've been using with year 11s. This time they don't know what the question is, but I'm getting them used to having an educated guess at the question, reminding them what an introduction needs to include, and then some structure there for their body paragraphs as well. I'm a big believer in worked examples, and by that I mean having examples that students can look at and analyze and manipulate, so that they get better with assistance before they can go on their own. And one of the scaffolded sentence or paragraph exercises I like to use is the but because so exercise. So here's just a brief example where you start a sentence with a phrase such as Australia is a liberal democracy, and then you finish it, you get students to finish it in 3 different ways. So Australia is a liberal democracy because, and then they have to think of a reason for that. Australia is a liberal democracy, but, and they have to think of a contrasting point. And then Australia is a democracy, so, and then they have to think of a consequence of that. I find that students tend to get much more used to a concept if they're manipulating it in different ways like that. And then you can do similar exercises with the words like although and despite and because. Just getting students practicing using more complex words to create more complex sentences. Sorry, I'm zooming through here. This is the first half of the paragraph that we had earlier. So one thing you can do with students is to give them the first half of a paragraph like this, and then you've got the word however, get them to finish it off. So I've used this as a warm-up activity sometimes when students come in, it's on the board ready for them to go. These are some suggestions from some other venerable teachers that I picked their brains about. So things like getting students to do essay plans for homework, and then coming into class and drafting a paragraph for a warm-up exercise. So it could be any of the paragraphs. Doing things like group paragraph writing, and I will admit I haven't done much of this myself, but I'm keen to try. So using collaborative software like Google Docs and other cloud apps to get student groups working together to draft different parts of a paragraph. So one student writes a topic sentence, one student writes the example, and so on and so forth. And then doing things like peer feedback with effective modelling, of course, so making sure students are aware of what effective feedback looks like. This is a template that was supplied by Dan, and I think Hayley Pepper from Perth College made some additions to it as well. Dan, do you want to jump in and talk to this one?
Yeah, so this is the kind of rubric that I would use when doing feedback with students. One thing that we know from research is that left to their own devices, students will provide fairly low quality feedback to each other, just like, oh, topic sentence was good or something like that. And therefore they're not sort of identifying in their own mind what is an effective topic sentence, or what is an effective definition, etc., etc. So this, giving them this rubric allows them to read somebody else's work and judge them accordingly. You can then go through with them how this matches up with, say, the essay marking guide that's used in the WAIS. Something that I've also included down the bottom is you want to get students to reinforce the positives, the things that they are doing successfully already, that you want them to keep replicating, because we know that by reinforcing the positives, students will continue doing those things. And then identifying, you don't want a laundry list of things to fix necessarily. Sometimes that is the case, but just having one or two key focus areas of, if you address this one thing in your introduction, if you tweak it slightly, or if you include something that you missed out, it'll take you from a one, I'm thinking of conclusions, but think of it that way, from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3. That is sort of like your next step. So that is how I use this. The box in the top right-hand corner is, instead of writing their name, students draw a symbol, and then you can randomly redistribute the samples that you collect, or say practice introductions that you get students to do. That way it's not, name and shame. It's completely anonymous. And it's, healthy for the classroom.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is an awesome resource, and I'm going to borrow it and use it myself.
And we'll send it out with the PowerPoint and the resources from this Zoom, shall we?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So thanks very much to Daniel and Hayley, who gave me a lot of assistance with that. So listen, I know that there are a lot of teachers out there, so with a wealth of knowledge. So there are lots of different approaches and resources available out there. So happy to take questions, but also happy for teachers to jump in with their own ideas, resources, and opinions. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Anyone want to jump in with questions, comments, feelings, thoughts?
Ooh, that's a good idea.
Collaborative paragraphs with whiteboard markers on the desks. Great, yeah. If you've got writable desks, that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, it's so much more accessible. I mean, obviously Google Docs is there, and if it's accessible to you, that's great. But yeah, if you can do this physically, or even just on, like, butcher's paper, chart paper, because if you get students, say in a group of 4, they break down a paragraph and write a section of it each, they're talking, hopefully, they're talking to each other about what examples they should be using and how they're going to link the different parts of the paragraph to each other. And if not, their paragraph is going to look really disjointed. So it reinforces some of the essential skills we're looking for.
And those conversations in themselves are learning opportunities. So it's double the value. Under time pressures, how would you advise us to divide our time, and what to do if we aren't keeping up with time? Good question. Lots of practice. So practice lots of timed essays. If you aren't keeping up with time, then it's always worth, if you're really rushed at the end, it's always worth doing a few dot points just to show the marker that you have thought about it and you haven't left it out, but you just ran out of time. Any other thoughts on that?
Really, it's just about making sure you practice under time conditions, making sure you practice without notes in front of you at the end of the day. The scaffolds need to be taken away.
Yeah.
And you get into habits of like, I'm going to practice writing a conclusion within 5 or 6 minutes.
Right.
So that, you know, you're writing your essay, you're going as quickly as you can, but then as soon as it gets to, you know, the 5 minutes to go, you write a conclusion because you know it's worth 8% of your overall essay mark.
Right.
Like, just it's a bit of mindfulness and a bit of discipline, like just keeping track of those things in your own mind.
Yeah, and that's a good idea. Actually, you can break the 50 minutes down or the 55 minutes down into little chunks, and you'd probably spend 10 to 12 minutes on a body paragraph. Would you think, Dan?
Yeah, that sounds about right. If you divide it 50 minutes into segments, that's yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, have a go at those little sub elements as well.
Yeah. Shout out to Miles, who he says one thing we've done as a class is go through newspaper and other sources to get examples and figure out which essay questions they can relate to. Particularly good at the end of the year when you've got all these syllabus dot points and you're trying to work out which examples to prioritize.
Yes, and on that point, could I recommend following the PLEAWA Twitter account run by Hayley Pepper from Perth College, because each of those posts are hashtagged with syllabus dot points. So it's a really good place to find a repository of examples for each syllabus dot point.
Cool beans. All right.
All right.
Does anyone have any last minute questions?
Oh yes, or the Instagram, the PLEAWA Instagram. Please follow that.
All righty. I think we might end it there. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. What a great turnout. I'm very pleased.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, for hosting. Thanks to PLEAWA. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to all the teachers for your input.
All right. Thanks very much, Ben. And we will see you all later.